Welcome to AI Founders Mindset. This podcast dives into the stories of visionary founders and the incredible people who power the startup ecosystem. Whether you are building your own venture or simply curious about the world of startups, you are in the right place. Today's episode, the conversation with Neal, the director at TechStars San Francisco, and George, the founder CEO at Noetic. Part 1. We talked about George's startup, Noetic, and why TechStars is so special. If you like this episode, please subscribe our channel and also give your like. Thank you so much for attending podcast today. So how are you?
I'm good. And isn't this a special one? Well, it's special because it's Kaori's 100th episode. So congratulations. Yeah, so I'm doing great. And then Kaori was kind enough to ask me to bring a guest and a friend. And so now I nominated George. So George, introduce yourself.
Yeah.
Neal Sensei and George. Neal Sensei and George.
That's
George,
right.
Yeah, nice to meet you all. So I'm George, I'm founder of Noetic. I'm one of Neal's cohort startups. So Neal invested through TechStars in me and 11 other companies in this round. So very happy to be here in San Francisco. I normally live in Tokyo, here for 3 months and going back. And I think today we're going to discuss a bit about building more of a connection or helping to build the connection between these two cities and these startup communities, which I have a lot of thoughts on as well. So thanks, Kaori.
Very good.
Yes, thank you so much. So I have tons of questions. But at first, tell us about your fun fact first, Neal.
A fun fact. So a fun fact about me is, it's connected to Japan, actually, which is, that's my favorite place to go snowboarding. So I love snowboarding in Japan, specifically Hokkaido, Niseko. I've gone all the way down to Hakuba, near Nagano as well. And yeah, that's one of my favorite things to do in the whole world. That's my fun fact.
Very nice. I mean, following on from that, I haven't been snowboarding in Japan, but I've lived there for 5 years now. And
Really?
That's right, yeah. And so I've been there. I was the first Shibuya startup visa, or maybe second, hey Wei, my friend Wei, we were kind of at the same time, but so I've kind of seen it evolving and growing since then. And TechStars just recently, at the same time as San Francisco, went to Tokyo, and I went to the demo day. So as I say, I have a lot of thoughts. I feel like that's a very fun fact. So let's go.
Yeah. So
What's your fun fact?
My fun fact is, So I am already over 30. I gave up to wear high heel. I don't want to do無理をしない. What can I say in English?
無理をしない actually done わからない I don't know that word.
So yeah, I don't want to do tons of effort for fashion. This is my fun fact.
Okay. Well, that's mine too. I also gave up high heels. I don't wear them at all anymore or ever.
Recently stopped.
Thank you so much, guys. Yeah, so 3 of us, we are kind of we have a connection with Japan, Tokyo. Ne? Okay. First of all, tell us about your startup. So you established 3 or 4 years ago, correct?
Yeah, so I established first in Tokyo. I was working at the Australian and New Zealand Chamber of Commerce and the Embassy. I was moving to the British Embassy, Department of International Trade. COVID happened, so I decided to focus on my startup and begin that. So it was in 2022 really that I started focusing on that. I established a Godo Kaisha first, and then I established a Delaware C Corp. So I did it the wrong way around. I don't recommend that to anyone. All foreign founders looking to go to Tokyo, don't do that. But yeah, I started working on it in Tokyo, and my first clients and revenue are there. So yeah, and what we're doing is we're building, trying to explain it in a simple way here, basically an ongoing conversation. It's a form of market research, but imagine rather than conducting quarterly surveys, you're always talking to your market. And it works in Japanese as well. So we conduct surveys for international schools going to different areas of Japan, for age tech, Yeah, as well. So it could be foreign companies entering Japan and they want to test their age tech product in the market. And so we've done some of those studies as well. So please. Oh, so technology for elderly people to help with the aging process. Yes. So my favorite client, biggest client and investor, he has a sort of symposium and project called Living Best. Living Best, and I also want him to come over here more. He might come to demo day, and we're trying to again, build that bridge. And we've had companies from Israel, America, from France, UK as well coming, and Canada coming over to Japan, bringing their age tech solutions. So yeah, that's basically what we're doing at the moment.
I see. And I saw your company's Noetic website. And then, is this B2B software, correct?
That's correct. It's B2B SaaS, that's right. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that, Kaori.
And so, B2B means?
So business to business. So we're a business selling a solution, a software solution to other businesses to conduct consumer research. So traditionally, you'll go, if you know SurveyMonkey, things like that, or conduct a really in-depth market research project. Rather than doing that and spending $100,000 in multiple months in these huge projects, what we're trying to enable is this, again, ongoing conversation that's sort of a recurring, constant feed of consumer insights. So imagine it's like having your market as part of your team, and you can always talk to them. And it's at every decision point you can run things by them, ideas, instead of these big surveys. And now the idea as well is to, similar to if you know Canva, to democratize the ability to conduct research, because you don't need to design it. You can just ask questions. And then the system handles the actual logistics of it. So
amazing. And then, so I saw, so your website has like step 1, step 2, and step 3. So step 1 is kind of from the like graphic, video, like it's AI agent and the conversation in real time, correct?
That's right. So basically, when you conduct a market research study, you'll go through the process of designing the research, fielding or like sending out the surveys, and then analyzing and reporting. And we're trying to make that an entire sort of agile, so iterative, like a Kaizen kind of approach. And so it's all in one and in real time, making it that way. So yeah.
I see. Thank you. And then you said your first client is a Japanese company.
Yes, Japanese company with an Australian CEO. That's the card.
Wow.
Yeah. So,
niche. Wow.
Yeah, and he's going to be on my demo day video. So hey Dom, Dom will see this. Hello Dom, I love you. So yeah, that's Japanese team, Australian CEO. It's a very interesting setup, and they're wonderful. And I probably shouldn't go into who their clients are. Let's go to the next question.
I see. Thank you so much. Okay, let's talk about TechStars.
Sure.
Yeah, so today, 100th anniversary. My guest Neal and George wore TechStars t-shirts and hoodie. Yeah. So
We'll get you one.
Oh, so sweet. Thank you. So there are many famous and super local accelerator and also venture studio. I think for our audience, some of them or many people, we don't know the difference between venture studio or agency or accelerator. So my understanding is kind of a boot camp or school for startup founder. But could you please explain about it?
Sure, happy to explain. And obviously it'll be even better coming from George, who is a part of the program now. But as managing director of TechStars San Francisco, my explanation of what an accelerator is the word accelerate. Accelerate is to speed up, right?
Like Axel.
Yes, so if a business is doing good, we want to help a business do great. So there might be one customer, we help you get 10. Or you might have an idea and we help you make a product. Or you might have lots of customers and a good product, but maybe you need more connections to scale. And last but not least, what an accelerator primarily tends to focus on is helping companies figure out how they are going to either fundraise or bootstrap their business. So you get to profitability or you find a way to generate revenue. And our entire kind of program focus is giving each company what they individually need support with a set of workshops and kind of activities that help each of the businesses stay connected, but also grow in all of their own separate ways. So that's like my rough summary of what an accelerator is. Should I pass to George to find out his version of it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool, thanks, Neil. Yeah, that and beyond that, even so, the workshops and the learning are all fantastic. Neil has a special way of running things, which is really unique, and I really would like accelerators in Japan to learn from Neil. Neil Sensei needs to make a few trips.
Both ways.
Both ways. But beyond that, even it's really the network as well that's so unique. And again, being here in San Francisco in the Bay Area is an unrivaled networking opportunity, I would say. So anyone looking to apply to this, don't reach out to him directly, but apply. I think it's probably past now, but yeah, it's been an absolutely incredible experience. And I've done accelerators before in Japan, actually. So from SoftBank and a short one from 500, and they're all.
Already?
I've done a few.
Really?
I've learned a bit, but I've learned an inordinate amount here from Neil. He's really good. He's an absolute and everyone else. Neil and his network. It's really unrivaled. I've never seen anything quite like it. So thanks to this man here. And I'm sure the other 11 startups in this cohort feel the same way, and all your other Chicago alums. So yeah, it's been an incredible experience, and I couldn't be more grateful. But really excited to see where we can take it, and how we can take some of this experience, this knowledge, and these learnings, and bring them over to Japan as well.
I have a question for George.
Yes.
Go ahead, Neil. Ask me.
I have a question. I'm going to take your job for a second. Okay. So my question for George is, what's the best way for someone to figure out whether an accelerator is right for them relative to the incubators and the other like types of startup spaces?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, so it's all in the name, really. It's accelerate. We've got to hurry up.
Quick.
Yeah, we've got to go faster. So if we already have some traction, we've had an idea, we maybe have a few clients, we're starting to make progress, but what we really need is that unlock where there's something missing. And I felt that for the past 2 to 3 years. There's something missing here. I need to learn from a master, essentially. And that's why I joined this accelerator, is to really learn and fill the gaps in my knowledge and reach that next level. It's really about going not so much from the idea to the traction, but to building upon that and making a real business. Because, it feels like a project until you really create a real business. Mm-hmm. So it's a repeatable business model as well, yeah. Instead of just, POCs and pilots and letters of intent. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. So I think what he just said is sometimes a lot of companies at the early stage have more ideas than they have substance, and more than they have real commitments from customers or anything else. So we help make those commitments real.
Scale your value.
And scale the value. That's exactly right.
Yeah, I love this part, like scale the value. For example, like maybe many founders, they can do they can get, one customer, one client, yay. But thanks to master's knowledge and practice, for example, by small effort and then making big impact, correct? Image.
Yeah, I mean, people like Neil and his network, there are so many people that he's introduced us to, and they've given us a wealth of advice. And they really, because they have that experience and they've been through it, they know exactly which levers to pull, right? That's something we talk about a lot, is what leverage points to sort of add this knowledge here, maybe push this founder a little bit in this way to unlock their sort of perspective and maybe make them think about something a little differently. Just add a little bit of value here and there to really create. It's really, I would say, in an accelerator at this stage, it's also so much about the founder and the founder's learning. It's the business, yes, but it's really about building upon that founder's sort of passion and drive and that sort of unique insight they might have and then really giving them the frameworks and the ways of thinking to actually, as I say, scale that value, or the value that individual can provide to the world in a way. And yeah, again, ask this man.
Yeah, so I love your explaining. For example, I love this one, mindset. Everything depends on mindset. We can change my mind. Okay, my English is still beginner, but okay, I am a professional interviewer.
You are?
Right? Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So anyway, so from 100 episode, I gonna change my podcast title to founders mindset or AI founders mindset. Yeah, so I'm curious, before joining this cohort, TechStars SF cohort, and then you are graduating, right?
Good.
Yeah, demo day is next week. So before and after, what do you think your mindset is kind of change?
That is a good one that no one's asked me yet. So,
Very good.
I think prior to coming here, there was a real, I wouldn't say fear or apprehension, but just it's the unknown, right? There's that feeling of there's something missing here. I have no idea what I'm missing exactly. I know I have the intention, the passion, the drive to do this, but I've tried many ways to fill the gap, and it wasn't until now that I can really see the path forward. That's what this has really done. And I think my fellow cohort members feel the same way, is that everyone here, the TechStars team, they've given us what we need to move forward and really figure out all those areas of business, whether it be sales, product, leading a team. That's a big one. Just observing this man, the way he leads his team and the way they work together and the way he operates has been genuinely inspiring, because that's something that I have struggled with. I'm very good at making friends with my co-workers and employees, but really to lead is something very different from just being friends. So that's been a huge takeaway from Neal. And all the other mentors as well, they're just so... TechStars has this motto that you may have seen of give first.
Give first.
Give first. And I can, every day, every call I get on, I can feel that. And again, I think that sort of virtuous cycle is what leads us to these... I don't want to get too meta and too philosophical, but that's the advancement of civilization, right? That's something Japan does very well, is within Japan, people take care of each other and they do give to one another, and they are very altruistic. And that creates this self-perpetuating cycle of upward improvement. And that's what startup accelerators, I think they do that in a very tactical, almost scientific way, especially the way Neal runs. It's almost, a science.
Really?
Of taking, I would say so. Cool. Tell them about Basecamp. And
They don't know the secrets.
The secrets, you got to come here to learn the secrets. But it's a science, really. It's taking an art, something that people think is an art, and really turning it into a science, I would say.
I would love to add one thing, because I think we should get meta and philosophical, and I think that's important, because you like to talk about these things, and for me, that's kind of what's in it for me. I'm not really interested in doing any of this business stuff unless it actually means that we're actually shaping and moving the world forward. Like we're actually making things better for us currently, but also helping direct the future and where it's headed. It's a really exciting time. There's new technologies coming out. Everyone's talking about AI. Everyone's wondering what the next big thing's going to be and how will all of our lives be affected by these new businesses that are emerging. So given all of that, for me, it's just a joyful experience to be able to bet on great ideas and great people who I think will help make more connections throughout the world, and through more connections, more innovation, and through more innovation, more progress. I'm trying to go to space. You know what I'm saying? Let's go. So let's figure it out. Yeah, exactly. So we'll do that.
We're really trying to sort of, in our own little ways, sort of pivot and tilt the sort of trajectory toward a good outcome, right? I think that's what the best founders, the best people in general, that's what they're doing, is they're just trying to push the trajectory of humanity more in the positive direction rather than negative. And being altruistic and that give first mentality, again, Japan does it really well, is the best way to do that. And if we all do that, well, there you have we're doing pretty well right now, but we can do better.
And I was going to say, like, one thing that founders tend to be really worried about is competition. Competition, yeah. And what I explain is usually, and to George and everyone else in this class and all the previous classes we've run, who cares? So it's everyone's opportunity to take a shot at solving a problem, and it's no one person's problem to solve. So come one, come all. If I have competitors, people who are trying to get the same customers as me or solve the same problem as me, well, I hope we're both successful. Exactly. But even if only one of us succeeds, that means that the other person inspired the other to be better.
Absolutely.
Right? So what's the point of doing anything without having someone else to either share it with or to pursue it with? So I treat the other accelerators with full respect and admiration and appreciation. Coming to San Francisco recently as TechStars is a very unique thing because one of the most successful accelerators in the world is already here, right? And many others. And everyone's like, well, what are you going to do as TechStars to compete? And I'm like, I'm not really competing. It's fine. Like, I'm happy for them. I want them to work out, and I want ours to work out too. And I can invest in 12 companies or so at a time, and they're investing in a lot of other companies too. And let's hope some of us make it, right? So that's how I think about it.
Absolutely. And I mean, like, the key here is, I mean, it sounds cliche, but everyone's unique. Everyone has their own unique value to provide to the world. And yeah, we may be competing, but we can all add our own spin on, even if we're competing in the same field, bring our own philosophy, our own life experience. And this man has a lot of unique life experience you can talk about. And yeah, it's adding that into the mix. It's sort of like a alchemy in a way. Yeah.
The 3 key takeaways from a conversation with Neal and George, part 1. 1. Why San Francisco is the heart of global startups. San Francisco is not just a city, it's a unique ecosystem where innovation, investment, and mentorship thrive. The episode explores how San Francisco provides unrivaled networking opportunities and why it's a global hub for founders looking for connect, learn, and scale their startups. The connections made here can serve as a bridge between regions, fostering growth in startup communities worldwide, including Tokyo. Key takeaway 2. How accelerators speed up startup success. Neal described an accelerator as a program designed to take a good business and make it great. This takeaway drives into how accelerators like TechStars San Francisco help startups gain more customers, refine their products, and source funding through tailored mentorship and workshop. The focus is on providing founders with the tools they need to grow quickly and efficiently, transforming idea into impactful business. Key takeaway 3. Shifting to a founder's mindset. The episode emphasized the transformative impact of mindset in a founder's journey. George shared how his time in Neal's cohort helped him not only scale his business, but also evolve as a leader. The TechStars philosophy of give first create a culture where founders learn to lead with empathy, resilience, and strategic thinking. The key is to drive their startup forward. Thank you so much for watching our video podcast today. So next episode is the conversation with Neal and George part 2. Please stay tuned. If you like this episode, please subscribe and give your like. Bye bye.